It's time for us once again to dive into the Gospel of Luke. Glad that you're watching and participating in this study with us. Jesus has come to Jerusalem. Now, he comes to Jerusalem a number of times throughout his ministry, but when you read Luke's Gospel, this visit to Jerusalem is this obvious climax of Jesus' entire ministry. Everything that he has come to this earth to accomplish. Luke, beginning back toward the end of chapter 9, begins directing our thoughts to Jerusalem as Jesus' mind is set in that direction as well. And so, as he comes to this point, we're going to begin our study today in verse 41 of Luke chapter 19. And before we do get into that, in case you don't know, there is a study sheet that's available for our class. This particular study today, that can be found on Facebook, posted at several places. The church's Facebook page, the Facebook page group for this class specifically, then on my own personal Facebook page. And so those questions are there. There's just a few of them. Again, not necessarily a study guide in that it leads us through the text to flesh out the meaning. The idea behind these questions is just to get our minds engaged, thinking about the text that we're getting ready to study. So we begin in verse 41. Now, before we start there, it's probably well for us to remember what has just been recorded by Luke, and that is the triumphal entry. Jesus has come to Jerusalem. He's outside the city. He's come through Bethany and Bethpage, small villages. Well, we know where Bethany is. Apparently, the location of Bethpage is questionable. That is, it's in question. Maybe I should say it that way. So he's coming by the Mount of Olives, and he's going to be descending the Mount of Olives, crossing the Kidron Valley. This is all on the eastern side of the city, and the city wall is there. And then just on the other side of that wall is the temple compound. And so Jesus is coming. Now, as we looked in our last study, as he does that, the multitudes are hailing him as king. And they are doing so in such a public manner. He's riding on the foal of a donkey, and they are laying their garments out before him as he is coming toward the city. So this is all happening outside on his way to the city. And then, verse 41, and when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that even you had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they're hidden from your eyes. For the days will come when your enemy will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." It is a striking contrast with all of this rejoicing. The people were rejoicing as they were hailing Jesus and welcoming him as king, in spite of the fact that their understanding of what that exactly meant, their thinking was not correct. But Jesus allowed this to be happening. And in the midst of all of this rejoicing and hailing him as king, a very joyous occasion, Jesus beholds and he looks and he sees the city of Jerusalem, and he is overcome by emotion. And he begins to weep over the city. And so that is a very great contrast. But as Jesus looks at the city, he mourns over it because of what has transpired in the past leading up to this day, and what's getting ready to happen to this city. Now, we might remember that way back in chapter 13, we had recorded there the words of Jesus as he lamented the city. This is in verse 34. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it," and on it goes. That was prior. This, though, now Jesus is thinking about Jerusalem and the fate that awaits it. Now, we get over to chapter 21, and Jesus is going to have some more things to say about the temple and the city, exactly what's going to happen to it. Here, it is, I think, more of a pronouncement of the punishment that's going to come. Chapter 21 is going to be a description of that punishment, what that's going to look like when it happens. But now he is simply pronouncing the fact that it is going to happen, and it is going to be severe. They will tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. Will not leave one stone upon another. I want to look at our questions here for just a second, and we've already answered the first of these. What did Jesus do as he neared the city? Well, he wept over the city of Jerusalem. And what had the multitudes just done? They'd been rejoicing. They were probably still in the process of rejoicing, welcoming Jesus as their king. But Jesus says the reason why this judgment was going to come upon them. Our second question, what was the, quote, time of your visitation, end quote. This is going to happen because you did not know, Jesus said, the time of your visitation. Well, that visitation, I think, obviously is a reference to Jesus, God in the flesh, being among them. This was God visiting his people, and yet they didn't recognize him as such. They didn't recognize what was happening right here before their very eyes, and had been happening now for some time. They didn't get it. And not only did they not get it, they absolutely rejected Jesus. And so, Jesus weeps. His heart is broken because this is not the way things were supposed to be. This was not how it could have been had these people recognized Jesus, had they embraced him, had they embraced what Scripture had been saying all along about who the Messiah was, what he would be, and what he would do, and how he would minister, and what he would accomplish. This could have been a time of peace for Jerusalem, but it was going to be far from peaceful. And we'll get into more details of that as he discusses that in the 21st chapter. And so Jesus, he's not in Jerusalem yet, but approaching it. He is weeping over the city. Continue on, beginning verse 45. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." Jesus cleansing the temple. It's recorded in all four Gospels. John indicates to us that this happened actually once at the beginning of Jesus' ministry and once at the conclusion. I think what we have here is obviously that second of John's recordings, but it's in all four. And Luke's account of it is by far the shortest. It's the most brief account of Jesus cleansing the temple. And he simply says he began to drive out those who sold. What's happening in the temple? Of course, we're coming up on Passover. The day of Jesus' triumphal entry would have been a Sunday. This very well, in all likelihood, happens that same day. He comes into the city and he goes to the temple. And in preparation for the Passover, the pilgrims, the Jewish pilgrims who are coming from all over the Roman world to celebrate the Passover, know that there are some things that are going to be required of them to participate in the Passover, in offering the sacrifices that they need to make, and to offer the monetary offering that they need to make. So what was being sold, as he says he drove out those who sold, were those who were selling animals for sacrifice in the Passover, the upcoming Passover. Not only that, but remember the other accounts talk about the money changers. There was only certain coinage that could be used as the Jews believed in their offerings in regard to the temple, and so there was exchange of monies going on. It was business, and it turns out that the Sadducees were one who really had control over the temple and the goings on in and around the temple. And put it flatly, they were making a killing. They were taking advantage of these people who have traveled these distances to come to offer sacrifices, to participate in the Passover, and the exchange rate is not fair, it's not right. The sacrifices, the animals for sacrifice that they are selling are less than quality animals, and yet charging great prices. And Jesus is abhorred by what he sees. He's abhorred by that. And he said, this is supposed to be a house of prayer, and you look what you've done. You've made it a den of thieves. What's happening here as Jesus has come into the city of Jerusalem? His heart is broken over what the punishment is going to be for this city and its inhabitants. The city itself is representative of the Jewish nation, the nation of Israel, and what an important part they were to play in the unfolding of God's plan to bring salvation and redemption to all of humanity through one of their own, Jesus. And yet the Jewish people, their whole approach was so skewed. It was so out of line with the will of God. They had taken advantage of the place into which God had placed them. And what was going on in the temple was just a visible manifestation of how wrong-headed they were about everything. And it's obvious that Jesus is not going to let that pass by. Jesus is bringing everything to a head. We mentioned this last week with the triumphal entry, in that Jesus was just letting the people go. He was letting the people express and feel whatever it was they wanted to about him, and they thought he was the king, they thought he was the Messiah, and they were wanting to proclaim him as such and welcome him as such, even though they did not rightly understand that role and what it would mean for one to be the Messiah. That's been evident all the way throughout the gospel. And now, the religious leaders, Jesus is really going to shine a glaring light, particularly in these last days leading up to his climactic crucifixion and resurrection. He's going to use the events that are transpiring to show this light. He's not backing away. He knows what the end result of all of this is going to be. He knows he's going to be arrested, persecuted, tried, and killed. But he's not avoiding it. And he knows why that's going to happen, and he knows at whose hands these things are going to happen. And he is showing who they are and what they are. And so he takes this very bold action of driving out those in the temple who were selling, exchanging money, taking advantage of their fellow countrymen as they've come to worship God. Now, we get this 2 verses from Luke about that, but he continues, verse 47, and he was teaching daily in the temple. Now, we've got these days from Sunday to Friday when the Passover meal would be eaten by Jesus and the apostles. So Sunday to Friday, this is what's often referred to as the Passion Week. And what Jesus is doing during the days is he is going to the temple and he's teaching But Luke goes on to tell us that the chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people were seeking to destroy him, but they did not find anything that they could do, for all the people were hanging on his words. Our next question on our study sheet asks, what is the expressed intent of the leaders for Jesus? And that it is that they would destroy him. Who appears for the first time among his opponents? Well, actually, there are two groups mentioned here. I say groups. The first is really not a group, it's a pair. But that is the chief priests. Now, they have been mentioned one time previous, and that was when Jesus foretold for the first time that of what was going to happen in Jerusalem. This is back in chapter 9, I believe it's about verse 22. And Jesus identifies there the chief priests as ones who would treat him this way. But this is the first time they actually enter the storyline, that they are participants in the story of Jesus. So we have the chief priest. The other group that's mentioned that we've never seen this group designated before are the principal men of the people. They're not necessarily the religious authorities, but they are leading men among the people in Jerusalem. They no doubt were ones who were benefiting and profiting from the religious system as it then stood, with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and everything that went on with the temple, everything about that. They were a part of it. And so they saw Jesus like scribes and Pharisees saw Jesus as a very threatening influence on the status quo, on their well-being. And so they're mentioned as opponents of Jesus who want him destroyed. But one other thing here is that to mention the chief priests and the scribes, that shows us that this opposition to Jesus and the intention to eliminate him is now, those plans and those intentions and purposes are actually coming from not just the scribes and Pharisees scattered throughout Palestine and Galilee and other places that we've run into before, but it's coming from the Sanhedrin. It is coming from the very highest echelon of religious / political leaders of the Jews. And so this has gone to the top. And this is where the effort is being spearheaded now. So they are seeking to destroy him, but they're unable to get a foothold. There's no chink in his armor. There's nothing that they can do to carry this out, to fulfill what they're wanting to do. And a part of what they are up against is not just Jesus, as if that's not formidable enough, but it is that the people were so favorable to Jesus. And so these people had to be very, very careful about how they conducted themselves and exactly what they did, because it could blow up in their faces very easily if they took action against Jesus, and the people would respond in Jesus' favor and against them, and they really couldn't afford to do that either. So, as I said before, Jesus is not backing away from this. As a matter of fact, he is shining a light on how things really and truly are. There are two sides to this thing, and Jesus wants it clear in the minds of people and of us today even, that he, as God's Son, was here to accomplish one thing. And those who were the supposed representatives of God's people on this earth were so misguided and so out of line with the will of God that they were actually working in opposition to God's own Son. Well, let's continue on here. Let's move into chapter 20. And here, first of all, in the first 8 verses, one day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple, we've already seen he's doing this daily, and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders came up and said to him, "Tell us by what authority you do these things, or who it is that gave you this authority." Very likely a reference back to his activity in the temple, where he drove out those who were selling in the temple. This was supported. When I say this, the buying and selling in the temple, that was the doings of Sadducees. That was the doing, and Sadducees were kind of the upper level of Jewish religious authorities, although their position was much more political than were, say, the Pharisees. So the Pharisees were more common, but the Sadducees were more powerful. So they are challenging Jesus. They're pushing back. Jesus cannot go, in their minds, Jesus cannot go unchallenged for what he's doing and saying. And so they ask, by what authority are you doing these things? And Jesus responds to this. For us, classic Jesus, he doesn't answer their question, which reminds us that not every question that we are asked is worth answering. But think about it this way. If Jesus had answered that question directly, that would have served no good purpose. But Jesus rather turns this, which he does frequently, take what is said to him by those who are trying to challenge him and entrap him, and he turns it back on those people. And that's what Jesus does here. He says, I'll answer your question if you'll answer my question. Tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Well, that certainly caught them off guard. And they weren't prepared with a ready answer. They had to discuss that among themselves. And as they discussed it among themselves, they recognized that now they were the ones who were backed in a corner. Because if they said the baptism of John was from heaven, then number one, then why weren't you baptized by John? And Jesus has spoken to this point earlier. Then you have rejected heaven's messenger and heaven's will for you. But not only that, the testimony of John. If John is from heaven and what he is doing from heaven, then his testimony was coming from heaven. And the testimony of John was that Jesus is the Messiah. So they couldn't say that it was from heaven, because it would condemn themselves. But they couldn't say it was from man either, because, as they go on to observe, the people were convinced that John was a prophet. And if we say he was not, then they're ready to stone, they'll be ready to kill us. They'll be ready to stone us. And so they could not answer either way, and so they said nothing. And so Jesus' response to them was, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. You're not going to answer my question, then I'm not going to answer your question. So even in that exchange, Jesus very much exposes these people for, again, who they are. But it's going to continue. And so he begins to teach and tell the people a parable. A man planted a vineyard, he let it out to tenants, and went into another country for a long time. Apparently this was a common farming practice, that someone, a landowner, some wealthy person, would establish a vineyard. But he's not going to operate the vineyard. He would rent it out, as it were. There would be tenant farmers, that is, tenant vineyard keepers. And so that's what he did. Part of the arrangement, though, was that then he would gain a portion of the harvest from that vineyard. He planted it, he prepared it, he got it ready for it to be overseen and worked. And so he had a right to some of the produce, some of the profit from that vineyard. And so that was the idea here. But when the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him what was agreed upon, what he was supposed to receive from this. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And so he sends another servant. But they also beat him and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And so he sent yet a third. And this one also they wounded and cast out. And then the owner of this isn't going well. And the owner of the vineyard says, we've got to do something different here. 3 servants sent, and they're all treated horribly, beaten, they're thrown out. I'm not getting what I was supposed to get from these tenants in the vineyard that I own. And so what am I going to do? Okay, I will send my son. This is not just servant, this is my son. And perhaps they will respect him. But it didn't turn out that way. The son goes, and when the tenants see him, they say, this is the heir. Let's kill him so that the inheritance will be ours. And so they threw him out of the vineyard and they killed him. And when the owner of the vineyard, what then will the owner of the vineyard do to him? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. So the parable that Jesus gave here was, and again, very strong. We have violence and death as a part of this parable. And Jesus, the response by those who heard this, when they heard this, they said, surely not. But he looked directly at them. This is something that Luke doesn't do very often, tell us of these particular actions of Jesus like this. He looks directly at them and said, what then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Jesus is being so bold and straightforward. The overall message of this parable is just obvious. As a matter of fact, in the next verse, it's going to tell us that the scribes and chief priests perceived that he told this parable against them. And they were right. Now, how often did they not understand the parables of Jesus? But they didn't miss this one. They didn't miss the fact that Jesus was showing them in a very unfavorable light. Now, let's go back and let's think just a little bit about this parable. I think there's a primary message, but I also think there are some other things that are taught here that are important for us as well. I think there are some things that we're taught about God. Not saying that the master is God, but the actions of the master certainly do reflect and illustrate the actions and disposition of God. The master was patient. He sent servant after servant to these people, calling upon them to do what they were supposed to do. Makes us think of the prophets and how often God sent his prophets to his people. You remember the mourning of Jesus, the lamenting of Jesus back in chapter 13, verse 34. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you that kill the prophets and those who are sent to you." That's what God's been doing. He's been sending his people to try to get from his people what he truly desired from them. And the prophets were killed. And yet, God was patient. He did not respond immediately in a way that he could have responded, and it would have been appropriate for him to respond in bringing punishment against them. And it's finally until they reject his son that he takes his action against them, which suggests to us that God is patient, but there comes a point in time in which the patience of God comes to an end. And he's told us this, and this is the message to these people. As a matter of fact, they have reached that point in time. God's judgment is going to come against them because of their rejection of his own son. And that is the crux of this parable. You have rejected the master's son. It's even a fulfillment of prophecy that Jesus quotes in their own hearing. And the people are listening to Jesus, and they're not missing what he is saying here. And so the leaders, scribes and chief priests, they're really getting anxious about this. So we've got to do something to deal with this Jesus. And so, perceiving that he had told this parable against them, notice verse 19, they wanted to lay hands on him that very hour. I mean, they wanted it to end right there. They just wanted to take him, verse 47, back in chapter 19, and destroy him. They would have loved to have done it right then, but they feared the people. The people have become kind of a buffer here from, at least for this week, for a while. The chief priests and scribes can't do what they want to do to Jesus because Jesus is seen so favorably by the people. So instead, we've got to take a different approach here. And their approach is to watch him and send spies. That is, people who are going to carefully watch everything that Jesus says and does. They're going to pretend to be sincere and to try to catch him in what he says, so that they might deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. That is, the Roman governor. That's going to be Herod. They realize that this is going to have to play out in such a way that they're going to be able to accuse Jesus to the Roman authorities in order to happen what they want to happen. And so they send these people out, and they're going to try to trap Jesus. And so they say to Jesus, and here's their first effort. Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? And so, trick question. This was going to be a volatile question. Has there ever been a people who didn't have some negative thoughts and feelings about paying taxes? Well, the circumstance is no different. As a matter of fact, in some respects, the feelings are even more intense because of the Jews' hatred of the Romans. But nevertheless, Jesus again does what Jesus does. He knows what they're trying to do, and so he simply says, show me a denarius, a coin that was typically used to pay a laborer for as wages for his day's labor. Whose likeness or inscription does it have? Well, it's Caesar's. And Jesus says, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. They couldn't believe how effectively Jesus was able to handle everything that they threw at him. And they were left speechless. Literally, they were left speechless. They didn't know what to say. They had no response to that. So that's where we end our study today. It's not over by any means. But here in this last week leading up to Jesus' crucifixion, we have this back and forth between Jesus and the scribes and the chief priests. And their intent is not a secret. They want to destroy him. And yet Jesus also has his intent and purpose. As we said previously, he's going to shine the light on these people and expose them for who and what they are. And of course, they don't like it, which makes them hate Jesus even more intensely and want to take even greater measures to try to apprehend him and to destroy him. And so over these days, this is going to play out. We made mention of something in our last study when Jesus sent the two disciples as they had left Jericho and were coming toward Jerusalem. He sent the two disciples to go get that foal of a donkey and told them what would happen. You will go untie it and they'll ask you about it and you'll say this, and when you say that, they'll agree and you'll take it with you. And it says that when they did that, it happened exactly as Jesus said. And we made the point then, and want to make it again here in the midst of all this, that none of this is taking Jesus by surprise. None of this is catching him off guard. He knows how this is playing out and is going to continue to play out, and Jesus is orchestrating the whole thing. You remember in John's Gospel, he uses the language that my life is not taken from me, but I lay it down. If Jesus is going to be killed, and if he is going to be arrested and treated so shamefully, it's only going to happen because he allows it to happen. And that's what we're watching here. Remarkably, that's what we're watching as Jesus is making his way through this week, knowing what is just days away, but he continues to deliberately go in that direction because he knows this is the will of God and this is the purpose for which he came. Well, we're going to be continuing our study again. We want you to, if you'd like to, begin reading in verse 27 of chapter 20 and continue on through just into chapter 21, going through verse 4 there. And that will be the subject of our next study, and we'll look forward to that time together. We'll see you then.